All right, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So you've heard a little bit about the origins of ASEE, and so I'm not going to belabor the point, but Lisa Freehill has a nice article on how engineering became founded as a masculinized profession. And this is occurring at a time when mass production is getting online in the United States, and the U.S. is establishing itself as a colonial world power, and there's suddenly a lot for engineers to do. And the land grants, having been funded, are now gearing up to educate large numbers of engineers, and the profession is establishing itself. And it's transitioning from a craft and apprenticeship model to a learned profession, as others have said. And I just want to remind you that this is also the time in which the Supreme Court ruled that education and other parts of public life could be constructed in a way that was separate but equal along racial lines. And so we had engineering set up and founded as a white profession. And there is a counter narrative that I will get to in a moment. But there's a hegemonic model of masculinity that emerges in the United States at this time as we start seeing monopolistic capitalism take hold in the early part of the 20th century. And the US moves from a model of masculinity around the self-made man, where men distinguish themselves from boys, to a different model that is epitomized by Teddy Roosevelt, the rugged outdoorsman. And at this point, men become epitomized as different from women. And it's in this same time where capitalism is taking hold that engineering, in establishing itself as a profession, must establish itself as a white-collar profession. So engineering becomes defined by the exclusion of women. So this image is an image from Engineering News in 1915, and you see this heroic engineer, clearly a male, clearly ready to do rugged outdoorsy surveying stuff, right? And there's a celebration of sports and the outdoors and of various tests of manhood that qualify someone to be an engineer, which is quite different from the geek model that I think we're more familiar with today. So engineering education had the stuff that was going on at West Point and RPI and everywhere else had survey camps where engineers were going outside and doing surveying, and they were doing a lot of shop work and field work, and that this work was both deemed essential to make somebody an engineer, and it was considered unthinkable for women to be engaging in those activities at the time. This is also not coincidentally when the weed-out culture takes hold in engineering education. And so at SPE, up until 1917, no women were in attendance except as wives and daughters of members of SPE. And it's not until the end of the First World War that we see women presenting at SPE, and they did so instructing on how do you teach English. So the lectures were about English teaching, and there was a ladies' auxiliary committee that planned conference entertainment. So as we stand here at the precipice of Bev Watford exiting as the first African-American female president of ASEE, and a long string of 3 female presidents in a row coming on with Stephanie Adams as the president-elect, we are in a different situation than we were then. So that's not to say that there weren't women in engineering education. So there is a hidden history. It's not the dominant narrative, but Amy Biggs has a really nice book about this and some wonderful articles about this where she talks about how women are doing engineering work all along, but it's not often called engineering. So home economics is established as a field where we see faculty, Lillian Mahler-Gilbreth at Purdue or Ellen Swallow-Richards at MIT, who are doing work that is by any other name engineering, right? But it's not called that. And we see land grant programs at places like Iowa State where women are learning how to design things like stoves, refrigerators, things that relate to home life and are therefore considered in women's sphere and not labeled engineering, but by any other name they are engineering. They're taking all the physics and math, they're taking statics and fluids and all of those things and applying that in just a slightly different realm. And so when World War II happens in particular, but really in both world wars, we see women stepping up as men go into battle, women are left on the home front and in fact engaging in engineering jobs that men have left behind. And so it is that by 1950, the Society of Women Engineers forms, because there are a number of engineers that had been engaged in engineering work during World War II. However, it's just at this time, as the Cold War is getting going, that women are retreating back into the home, by and large. And so the opportunities for women in engineering are shrinking at that time. And it's not really until the Civil Rights Movement gets going and the women's movement gets started in the late 60s that we start to see women ask, well, how do we promote women in all careers, including engineering? And so in 1973, we see SWE partnering with the National Society of Professional Engineers to increase the numbers of women in engineering. And in the 1970s, we also start to see women in engineering programs becoming established at universities. And within ASEE, the Women in Engineering Division is formed in 1978. So similarly, there's a story of minorities in engineering education that's going on against this sort of broad narrative of engineering as a white profession by and large. And so Howard University in 1907 founded the first engineering program in the United States for people of color. And within this system of segregation that Amy Slayton does a really nice job of describing in her book, Race, Rigor, and Selectivity, where she covers the history of engineering's color line since 1945. I commend that book to you. She talks about the segregation and systematic under-resourcing of HBCUs, particularly in public education systems. So she does a case study of Maryland, where you really see the difference in the predominantly white institutions and HBCUs and how they are funded and how they are able to mount their engineering programs. And yet, HBCUs are instructing engineers in this time. And then we see in 1954, the Supreme Court decides that, in fact, maybe separate but equal wasn't such a good idea, and we start having integrated public education. And at that time, now predominantly white institutions are beginning to admit people of color in larger numbers. And it's not the best experience, surprise. So by the 1970s, we see blacks having organized in their engineering programs groups of students. And the Chicago Six got together at Purdue. Purdue had one such group of students, and they called together all the different student groups from around the country. And they had a conference, and they said, you know what, we should really found the National Society of Black Engineers. And we see similar patterns where we have a group of professional Hispanic engineers meeting in Los Angeles in 1974 and saying, you know what, we need a society. And the same thing happens with Native Americans. We have ASEE coming online in 1977. Minority and engineering programs are also emerging during this time period. And in the early 1980s, we see other minority groups following suit, where across STEM, we see LGBTQ founding the National Organization for Gay and Lesbian Scientists and Technical Professionals. That's a mouthful, not a step. And people with disabilities formed a group within the AAAS. Both of those formed within the AAAS because there wasn't a critical mass of people to have engineering-specific societies. And so it's, I think, not coincidental that it took an engineer president in Jimmy Carter to really think about the engineering workforce and diversity within the engineering workforce. And so in the 1970s, again, we see the National Science Board starting to track science indicators. Who is becoming an engineer in the United States? Who are we educating? And so Carter commissioned a major study between both the National Science Foundation and the Department of Education, where they included a focus on diversity, focusing on women, minorities, and people with disabilities. And in 1980, that's when the National Science Foundation begins to fund engineering work. So prior to 1980, they weren't focused in that area. But as soon as they did that, engineering was making investments in STEM education and in diversity efforts. And so we start at that point getting some research, and the literature starts to grow. And so it is by 1994 then, when ASEE issues the Green Report, that they actually speak to diversity for the first time in an ASEE study. And they say, gosh, we need to attract highly talented students with a wider variety of backgrounds and career interests, particularly women, underrepresented minorities, and the disabled. They hadn't yet used person first language, and that we need to empower them to succeed. And then you really start seeing ASEE get going in the 21st century. So I know it took a while, but it's pretty exciting news now. So in 1999, the Minorities in Engineering Division was founded. In 2002, ASEE committed to form a task force on diversity. Something kind of curious happened, and the diversity task force didn't get going until 2009. Someone else can fill me in on what happened there. But in 2008, IBM did this very cool thing, which is they stepped into National Engineers Week, and they said, you know what, we need to have a diversity council and really think about diversity in the middle of National Engineers Week. And they did a really nice job of drawing a big tent, thinking about diversity at that time. And so Novel Step, which, you know, LGBTQ hadn't really been part of the conversation. It was largely around women and minorities, conversations around inclusion in engineering. But IBM brought on Novel Step, and Tim Wilson, who's an engineer at Embry-Riddle, was able to participate on that council. And that ends up making a big difference for the emergence of LGBTQ as an axis of diversity within ASEE. So in 2009, the Task Force on Diversity really gets going, and we see the first ever paper on LGBTQ engineers that came to this conference. It won the Best Paper Award that year, which was a really strong sign of welcome from this society for that research. And in 2011, the ASEE formally established its diversity committee, and that committee has been just gathering steam and gathering steam. It's been doing a ton of stuff ever since. And you may have noticed some things like there is now a program at this conference. And there's a Best Diversity Paper Award program. There was a year of action on diversity in 2014 and 15. We've been doing Safe Zone Ally training since 2014. And there is now a Dean's Initiative on diversity that has been going on for a couple years. Deans have signed on. And Greg Washington's been leading the charge in getting the specifics together of what the goals are and how they're going to go about achieving them. And then, in 2017, ABET added inclusive teaming as a learning outcome in the recent criteria. And this was in large part due to members of ASEE really advocating for a long time about including diversity in ABET criteria. And while I think some folks would have preferred stronger language, we can work with this. We can do some things with this. So one of the things that's really happened as we've entered the 21st century is there's been a stagnation in numbers. So as you look at the 70s and into the 80s, there were great gains made in demographics as far as women and minority participation in engineering is concerned. But once those needles jumped, they kind of stagnated. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But our research then has necessarily shifted to focus not only on numbers, but also on culture, on structural change, on some of the root causes around racism, sexism, and ableism in society, and how that relates to our profession. Thinking about intersectional understandings so that we don't treat women and minorities separately like there aren't minority women in the world, and so on. And we're getting beyond pipeline models to really think about change. And so Greg Washington has done a really good job of framing the challenge for us in some presentations he's given, and he was kind enough to share some of his slides with me, and these are based on his work. But he points to a growing gap in underrepresentation that's going on that's quite troubling. So it's really a 35-year trend, but when you look at data of underrepresentation of minorities in engineering from 10 years ago and from today, you see a growing gap. So today, black students are 6% of first-year engineers, but 15% of the college-age population. And Latinx students are 13% of first-year engineers, but 22% of the college-age population. So we've seen gains in total numbers of Latinx students, but the population is growing, and the college-age population is growing, and we aren't gathering those students into engineering at the rate that we should. And so with this growing gap, we need to get very serious about how we educate students in engineering. And there's going to be this enrollment shortfall. Do you guys know about this enrollment shortfall that's coming? So there's this really interesting demographic thing that is happening in the US population. Between 2026 and 2031, we're going to have a 9% drop in high school graduates overall. And that population is going to be more diverse than the population that we have today. There will be fewer white students, more Hispanic students, a greater range of test scores, if test scores remain the same between now and then. And family income is projected to be stagnating at that time. So we're going to have people struggling more to pay for college in that time. And the even longer term trend, if you look at the Pew Research folks who study demographic trends, they noted that June 2016 was the crossover point where white newborns were the minority for the first time in the United States. So what are we going to do about that? So one of the things that, as I think about the future, is that we are immediately in a present moment of backlash, where we have been making, I think, a lot of headway within ASEE in talking about diversity. And we are also in a moment where the public rhetoric around diversity has become very toxic and very violent, and in fact, actions have become toxic and violent. And engineers are participating in this. So this is an Arkansas engineer participating in Charlottesville. Just FYI, right? That happened, wearing his shirt. So I think we need to think very seriously about what's been happening in our research community as well, as STEM diversity researchers have been targeted by members of the alt-right. And so Rochelle Gutierrez, who's a math educator at Illinois, has written a really nice article about reflecting on why it is now that her community of math education has been targeted by the alt-right. And she thinks it is exactly because of that broadening of focus that we've seen in engineering education, where we're saying, well, let's also look at culture, let's also look at structural change that needs to happen. And that has, as they have looked at privilege, at white privilege in particular, they have been targeted. And I'm really grateful that ASEE joined in responding very swiftly to this new trend that we're seeing, which is quite frightening. And so ASEE issued a really nice statement defending diversity research and researchers. And their statement stands with the statements of AERA and SACNAS and other professional societies, which is a really wonderful thing to see. But I think that what this all adds up to for those of us as educators is that the stakes are really high in the present political climate. And so that is why I argue that we must be immediately engaging in comprehensive diversity education for all engineering students. And we need to do this in a way that employs culturally relevant, inclusive, and liberative pedagogies. So the engaged pedagogies that Karl was talking about, with a consideration of power and how that plays out in the classroom, so that students are able to learn about diversity education and learn to dismantle privilege and be allies in that effort. And we have to understand that our students are coming in without the prior knowledge of our history in engineering education, where those of us that have lived through the past several decades have a story that we tell ourselves about civil rights and about increasing inclusion in society, and our students may not know that. Our students may be coming in without the benefit of those histories. So we need to start from square one and meet our current students exactly where they are and recognize the high-risk situation, particularly for students who are not in the majority, and to really think about what research we can do as an engineering education community about how engineering students in particular are going to grapple with difference, power, and privilege as they learn about that, and how we can develop a faculty with the capabilities to do this kind of work with students. So I'm suggesting that we immediately incorporate STEM diversity education in engineering. ABET has given us a window to do that with inclusive teaming. And I think what we need to remind ourselves is that we are already teaching diversity in our classrooms. What we teach is silence. And when we say nothing, we're teaching our students that diversity has no place in engineering, that we can't even talk about it. And so while we might think that we are remaining neutral, there's actually a null curriculum that's going on that's quite damaging to our students, in that, first of all, it's damaging to our minority students who may be experiencing microaggressions that go unaddressed. But it's also damaging to our students who aren't going to have the professional skills they need to work in a multicultural workplace. So what does that mean? How do we go about doing this? What are the learning outcomes, you say? This seems overwhelming. Well, the good news is that there are learning outcomes available to us that others have already established. So we can use ABET. We already have one learning outcome there, inclusive teaming, good. But we can also use curricula like difference, power, and discrimination, which Oregon State has implemented university-wide, and the engineers at Oregon State can tell you all about it. Ask one. They've been implementing it for about 20 years now, and they have a really good track record with it. The teaching tolerance curriculum that's used in K-12 has learning standards. We could look at those and implement those at the college level. Training and faculty development are essential, and they have to happen. What's great is that ASEE is really good at this. We've been doing this with the Safe Zone program now. We've been doing this with all kinds of webinars, virtual communities of practice across lots of different areas of engineering education. ASEE is super well positioned to do this. So we need a community of practice to share promising practices and troubleshoot things that are coming up. We can expect resistance. I think we all know what will happen in our home institutions when we go home and say we want to do this, right? Arguments about the crowded curriculum, arguments about this is too political are going to come at us. And we need to be prepared for that and insist on this as a professional competency, both for our faculty and for our graduates. And we need to prepare to support scholars that are increasingly going to come under attack in our community when they do diversity work. So how do we go about doing this? Well, we need diversity education for every engineering student. We have to know our students, we have to meet them where they are. We have to begin from page 1 and assume nothing. But we can leapfrog. We can draw on the history of what we have tried and what others have tried and incorporate all the lessons learned and use the most effective curriculum and pedagogy for these purposes. And we can remember what we already know. We have spent decades making the case for diversity. We can make all the cases, right? We can make the business case. We can make the competitiveness case. We can make the changing demographic case. We can make the legal case. We can make the ethical case. We can make the ABET case. We can make the case around our university's mission. We can make the case around basic human decency. We can make the case around social justice. And I think you understand, we need all the cases, and we need to make all the cases. And one of the more powerful ones, which Karl was alluding to, is that we have research. We have evidence here. Diversity education works. And we know what works. Intensive and immersive experiences are more effective. Relationships that have intergroup contact are what change people. Hearts have to be changed, not just minds. And that is, it's really telling that Karl was talking about how Sherry's study showed that hearts were not the emphasis in engineering education. It's time we start getting at hearts. So we need to manage change, we need to resource change, and we need to reward change. And I think we've learned a lot in the last 10 years or so in engineering education about how to do that well. And with that, I think we're ready for some interactive conversation. And Karl's going to get back up and lead us in this, because I'm shy.
I just want to highlight Donna's last point. And my mentors, David and Roger Johnson, argued that putting people in close proximity without changing the way that they meet and interact doesn't do anything to diminish prejudice.
Yes.
You've got to change the way they meet and interact. So thank you all for coming, for listening so carefully. Now we'd like to give you a chance to think about what you've heard. This is a procedure commonly called think, pair, share. I've tried to put it in a higher ed language. And to make it truly interactive, there needs to be going beyond the information. That's the creative piece. So here's some questions we came up with for you. We'd like you to take a moment and think about these individually. So what? What resonated? Were there things that Kate said, gee, I wonder about that? Are there questions that arose? Hopefully, if we did our job. So take a moment, think about it, individually, silently. I know that's not quite a minute, but thank you for respecting the silence. Many of us need a little time to collect our thoughts before talking with others. Now, turn to a neighbor.